They were known by a number of names. The people over there far away, the people of the setting sun, the giant enemy. The lost tribe of the Naha people mysteriously vanished centuries ago, but their blood-soaked legacy remains to this day, lingering among the misty mountains and dew-touched forests. The stories told of this barbaric tribe warn those who venture into the Nahanni that, although they haven't been seen for years, their influence and impression still have a tight grip on the Nahanni wilds. The Dene people for centuries feared the Naha. They would come from the mountains, signaling their approach with the ominous banging of their moose-skin drums and glowing torches, raiding, pillaging, and massacring anyone who got in their way. In ancient times, the settlements belonging to the Dene people were often subjected to their merciless campaigns of war, striking fear into the people of the lowland Mackenzie Mountains, leaving behind nothing but destruction and death. Renowned for their pure ferocity and bloody barbaric ways, the Lost Naha tribe were also known for being nomads, traveling through the valley, instilling fear everywhere they went. Written references describe them as incredibly primitive people. Whereas other tribes in the area adopted and used modern technology of the time introduced to them by the white man, the Naha people were said to strictly use crude stone tools and collectively live in a caveman-like society, who made their homes in the caverns and caves dotting the valley. Their disappearance and fate have been a mystery ever since their last warband was spotted long ago. Where they might have ended up or what happened to them, nobody knows. But the Lost Naha tribe remains in story and legend. There are some who believe they are still out there, hunting, killing, and decapitating. I am your host, Jordan Hopkins, and this is Moonlight Lore. Welcome back to the show, everyone, and welcome back to the Legends of the Nahanni Valley series. They were the first to inhabit that land. According to Dene oral traditions and stories, the Naha people traveled from mountain to mountain in search of wild game. When wild animals proved to be more elusive than normal, scouts from the tribe would travel upwards, near the top of the mountains, and scan the horizon for the blackened clouds of smoke or the glow of distant fires, indicating neighbors were nearby. But they weren't looking to trade. Upon returning to their camp, their scouts would report back their findings to the rest of the tribe, detailing the location of their new prey. The warriors, donning their infamous sheep wool robes and wooden and fiber cuirasses, would quickly arm themselves with clubs, axes, stone-tipped spears, and thick birchwood shields. When the warband was ready, they marched down the mountainside, guided by the glowing fire reflecting in their eyes from the settlement they were preparing to visit. The intense brutality that followed the inevitable skirmish would leave scars on the Nahanni Valley's history. Those who dared oppose the might of the Naha tribe often found themselves the subjects to sadistic torture. The bodies would be mutilated and their children would be killed. The typical spoils of war, like food and supplies, were always on their minds when they left for these raids, but oftentimes they would plunder something else, something far more valuable than material goods. While conducting these pillages on the tribes in the lowlands, they would also steal away the women and daughters of the tribe to bring back up to the mountains to live with them. These sorts of practices took their toll on the lowland tribes. Eventually, a council of elders for various groups in the region met to discuss a solution to this infestation residing in the mountains of the Nahanni. They all came to the unanimous decision to finally put an end to the danger the Naha tribe presented to the rest of the world. An immense warband formed from several different settlements, mostly made up of Dene warriors, who then marched across the Nahanni border, ready for war against the Naha. Even with their numbers, the army sent to destroy the Naha were still wary of the fearsome reputation their opponents held. The Naha were bred for war, an unstoppable force that plagued the valley for years, and nothing has been able to stop them. The Dene army fully expected to meet some sort of resistance upon entering the valley, but they were quickly surprised to find they could travel unhindered. Scouts up ahead of the moving force reported no presence of the enemy, so the massive group pushed forward towards the mountains. After a couple days of travel, one of their scouts spotted a plume of smoke emanating high from one of the tall Mackenzie Mountains. With this news passing through the camp, the Dene warriors armed themselves and began rushing towards their enemy. Of course, they knew they needed to be smart about this. They were about to do battle with the most fearsome warmongering tribe in the north, so the leaders of the war party decided a stealthy approach was the way to go, and to ambush the Naha when they least expected it. The warband quietly climbed the mountain and slowly surrounded their enemy's camp, and as soon as they were ready, the signal was shouted and every fighter sprang out from behind rocks with their weapons drawn. But there was no epic battle. What followed from the Dene war party springing into action was complete confusion. This was the camp of the Naha tribe, there was no doubt about it. The animal skin tents were pitched, the campfires were still smoldering, and objects like stone tools and fiber baskets were still laying out, as if only had been used recently. But there was nobody there. The Dene warriors were met with the least amount of resistance as possible. It was described, it was as if the Naha people had completely disappeared from the face of the earth. The haunting silence that followed the failed ambush was interrupted by a sting of the wind, crying out in its ghostly fashion as it's known to do in the Nahanni. Fear sweeping over them, and thinking if they lingered too long, their fate would be the same as the Naha. The Dene warriors hastily departed the camp and backed down the mountain towards the lowlands once more, never seeing the Naha tribe ever again. To this day, nobody knows what could have happened to them, whether they had simply moved on deeper into the hidden parts of the valley, or if perhaps a spirit had descended onto their camp, stealing away the tribe's people to an unknown place we will never know. All that remains of their existence are the stories that were passed down from the surviving tribes, and the everlasting terror the Naha stamped into the history of the Nahanni Valley. Over the years, theories on who the Naha people were and where they might have gone have bobbed up every so often, but the fact remains we just don't know. In my research, finding out how long ago the legend of the Naha tribe dominating the Nahanni Valley takes place is rather difficult. But descriptions of the Naha people, their Stone Age tools, primitive caveman-like society, and the artifacts found among the mountains of the valley, the best estimate we could figure was they reigned supreme roughly 10,000 years ago when they first entered the valley and settled there. When the legend takes place, and when they disappeared, that's a much larger mystery. But there are theories we can look into. Humans started to travel across the Bering Strait from Asia to North America roughly around 10 to 16,000 years ago. So quite possibly some of the people who had traveled into North America were likely to have been the Naha people who were the first to settle in the Nahanni Valley during around the end of the Paleolithic era, which supports the claim of their primitive Stone Age nomadic lifestyle. Now, probably being one of the first groups to have migrated into North America, they would have free reign over most of the continent, with very few tribes at the time to interact with or compete with. This would mean their society would grow and also expand to the point where they would need to migrate further south to a more comfortable climate than that of the frozen north. A theory that could explain the seemingly sudden disappearance of the Naha tribe from the valley is that they simply had headed south, migrating over 2,000 kilometers down to the Canadian prairies and then further on south into the warm deserts of the American Southwest. It's here they would become the first settlers, also known as the Navajo. This is of course just a theory and is fairly unlikely, but there have been a bit of evidence brought forth that supports it. If one was to compare Navajo dialect to that of the Canadian Dene people, one could find them both to be strikingly similar. In those rare occasions when one member from a tribe interacts with the other, they can find conversing to be quite easy. They even share similar words to describe similar things. For an example, even though they have no word for boat, living in the desert and all, the Navajo use the same word to describe the gliding of an owl flying, as the Dene use to describe the movement of a canoe gliding through water. If we also trace tribal ancestry back a few centuries, we find the Navajo and the subarctic Dene people share ties with the Western Apache, who also happen to have spoken a similar dialect. The Apache were known to be incredibly fierce and dangerous warriors, who also happened to reside in the American Southwest. Now, if we look into their name, it comes from an ancient group of people known as the Zuni, who were native to New Mexico. The Zuni people regarded their neighbors to the north as Apache, meaning enemy, the same way the Dene tribe up north described the Naha tribe. The Zuni also called the Navajo as Navajo, which meant large field. When the Spanish conquistadors marched onto American soil, this was the name they stuck with when addressing the Navajo Nation, and this was the name we know of them as today. But instead of Navajo, they have another name they call themselves, Dene. Of course, though, with so many similarities, there are also details that contradict claims the mysterious Naha tribe migrated south and became the Navajo or Apache people. While most historians agree both groups did come from the north, if we compare it to the legend of the Naha tribe, the Navajo had migrated several centuries before the Naha people were said to have disappeared. There is, however, one last thing I want to end this theory on. Although it's likely to have no real connection to the lost Naha tribe, it is a fun coincidence. Located in south-central Arizona, in the area the Apache once populated, lies an ominous mountain range known for similar legends to that of the Nahanni Valley. In 1540 AD, Spanish conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Corando led an expedition into these mountains in search for one of the lost cities of gold said to populate America. While venturing into the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, it was said his men began to mysteriously disappear in the night, with no trace of their whereabouts ever being known. Those few who were found missing their heads. Finding their decapitated soldiers, the group of Spaniards fled the mountains, never to return. And just like the Nahanni, rumors of the Superstition Mountains containing gold spread like wildfire, with prospector after prospector mysteriously vanishing or dying in eerily similar circumstances after venturing into the territory. Whatever had happened in the Superstition Mountains seemed to also take place in the Nahanni Valley. Whether or not they are connected in any way, that remains to be seen, but it is curious that the Superstition Mountains lie in Apache territory, who just so happened to also be suspected to be one of the descendants to the equally dangerous Naha people. Crazier things have happened, and there is a lot of history and coincidences that link all of these tribes together. For all we know, there could be much more. If perhaps one might not subscribe to the theory that the Navajo or Apache are descendants of the lost Naha tribe, others have pointed out the more likely fact that the Naha had stayed in the valley, where they would become the Nahanni Aboriginals. I believe in his book, Dangerous Rivers, Adventure on the Nahanni by Raymond Patterson, described the reputation of these Nahannis well. He wrote, "The Nahanni was straight suicide. The river was fast and bad, and if a man ever did get through those canyons, what would he find in the little-known country of the Yukon Divide? Gold. Gold without end, guarded quite likely by horned devils for all anybody knew to the contrary, but certainly by the wild mountain men. Indians, who never came into any trading post either in the Yukon or in the Northwest Territories. They lorded over the wild uplands of the Yukon-Mackenzie Divide and made short work of any man, white or Indian, who ventured into their country. Just ask the Indians there. Or better still, the Indians at Fort Wiggly. Why, you couldn't bribe them with all the marten in the north to go back west more than 30 miles from the Mackenzie." Believing the lost Naha tribe were ancestors to these Nahanni Aboriginals, those who ventured into the valley were convinced time and time again their assumptions were right. Following the violent and mysterious deaths of Willie and Frank McLeod, there were many who suspected these violent natives hiding in the mountains were the ones to blame for their demise. And those people might not have been wrong to suspect this. At the time, the Mackenzie Mountain Men were notorious for being known to be incredibly hostile to any trespassers who dared enter their territory. Whether they be white or of Native American origins, they didn't care. Anyone they were able to catch were subjected to their bloody beliefs. Already known to be incredibly distant from any communication with trading posts or travelers, they were considered to be a rare oddity. Very few would ever see or hear of them, but when somebody happened to, chances are they were met with one of their bladed weapons soon after. This is why, after the McLeod brothers were found dead and decapitated, blame on their deaths quickly shifted to these violent marauders. While Charlie, Willie and Frank's younger brother, firmly believed their partner Robert Weir was to blame, those who knew of the legendary mountain men and their reputation had a sneaking suspicion they were the ones to actually blame. Upon learning they were suspected for the crime, the entire tribe retreated deep into the wilderness and secluded themselves even further from the rest of society. And without much evidence to point to them being responsible, most people, and the Mounties investigating, decided it might be best to just leave them in peace, hoping to avoid any further run-ins with them. This, however, doesn't mean those hopes were answered, because they didn't disappear completely. People reportedly still had run-ins with this ferocious tribe, but claims of them being a violent people seemed to vary from person to person. Raymond Patterson, the man whose book I had just quoted from, had his own run-in with 8 of them while he was living in a cabin which was stationed somewhere in Dead Man's Valley. At the time, he was alone and preparing some food for the day when he felt an ominous presence of a large figure standing in his doorway. When he turned to look, he found a stern giant of a man staring back at him, not saying a word. Startled and confused why this man was here, Raymond gestured to him and offered some tea to his new acquaintance. The large man agreed and slowly entered the cabin, along with 7 other men. The intimidating men filled up the inside of Raymond's cabin, but seemed to be in quite good spirits when he had begun making their tea for them. With each ingredient thrown in, they seemed to grow more relaxed, until some began to smile and others began talking amongst themselves in their own language. A short time after everyone had gotten their own cup, the group was joined yet again by another man, a Yukon native man named Barney. He happened to have been traveling with a band of hunters and luckily was fluent in their language along with English and was able to act as an interpreter for Raymond, who wanted to ask the group some questions. He was able to learn the group had just come back from a hunting excursion down near Beaver River and were planning on returning the following spring for an annual beaver hunt they typically do. Raymond wrote this describing the end of his interaction with them. They must have been well tanked up on my tea now, but they stayed with it manfully and drained the bucket to the last dregs. They then rose up and departed without a word or a smile, and I sat there scratching my head and thought, well, it was probably their way of doing things. Going to work at cleaning up and washing the teapot and cups they had just used, he suddenly heard a loud thud, the sign of something heavy landing on the roof of his cabin. Leaving the confines of his makeshift home to investigate, he peered out a good distance and watched as the last of the hunting party disappeared into the thick brush by dog sled. Turning around, he then discovered the group had left behind a large quantity of fresh moose meat placed onto the corner of his cabin's roof, a sign of gratuity for his offer of tea and hospitality. It was by this time the Nahanni native population had dwindled down to a mere few, most succumbing to diseases like tuberculosis or smallpox by this point. Raymond Patterson had been credited on being one of the last few white men to ever have an interaction with this group of people, and last to have ever laid eyes on this once prosperous and proud civilization of Aboriginals. They were never seen again, and the theories about them being a violent group have been argued over ever since. Unfortunately, to everyone's knowledge, there are no living Nahanni natives left to refute or confirm the accusations casted onto them. With light of Raymond Patterson's experience coming forth, and the insistence of a few others claiming they were nothing more than just trying to exist in a fast-changing world, and weren't inherently evil barbarians like some claimed, we are simply left to wonder, who really were these people, and were they in fact responsible for the sinister reputation the Nahanni Valley holds? If history has taught us anything, it is to take much of it with a grain of salt. History is written by the survivors, those who have conquered and those who believe they were in the right. The first written text referring to the Nahanni Aboriginals comes from Alexander Mackenzie, a Scottish explorer who, in 1789, was navigating the Great White North on behalf of the Northwest Company, hoping to discover a path that would become the Northwest Passage. Of course, he wouldn't be the one to find it, but he did manage to find a group of Dene people somewhere along the Mackenzie River, which was later named after him. At the time, the Nahanni Valley, along with much of Canada, was sparsely populated by anyone other than Aboriginals, and with this, his expedition were discovering new flora and fauna to document. Probably hoping to avoid poisoning themselves with strange plants or hunting unappetizing creatures, they pressed for information from the local Dene, who were more than happy to share their knowledge of the land they were very much proud of. They did happen to warn them though, stay clear of the mountains, for there was a mysterious tribe there who would not be as welcoming as they were. Although Alexander Mackenzie failed in finding a way west, he was able to map out great locations for the Northwest Company to expand and establish fur trading posts, two of which became Fort Simpson and Fort Liard. Years would pass by with the Nahanni Valley staying a rather large mystery to most of the men traveling through the area. It wasn't until 1807 when a man by the name of Willard Ferdinand Wenzel learned the mysterious mountain inhabitants actually consisted of three separate tribes: the Dahotina, the Nambahatinas, and the Nahanni. All three inhabited the mountains to the west and waged war against one another in primitive and violent fashion. Eventually, as time dragged on, the Dahotina and the Nambahatinas ventured down the mountains and to the trading posts to converse and trade with the new arrivals in the valley. But the Nahanni tribe remained unknown. Pretty soon, a rapport between the two tribes and the Northwest Company grew, and it was quickly learned the two tribes were actually one and the same. Their names differ for the locations where they had lived. The Nambahatinas inhabited the southern Mackenzie Mountains in the Mountain Goat territory, while the Dahotinas lived in the northerly part. The Nahanni tribe, however, were still a mystery to much of the frontiersmen. When asked about them, the Nambahatinas remained tightly lipped, described to almost have a fear of even mentioning the tribe's name. The fear surrounding the Nahanni tribe also extended to the Dene people of the Mackenzie River. Those who did speak to them whispered they were a tribe of fearsome giants, cursed by the gods for their evil and unnatural practices. Though it did slip that the Nahanni territory was excellent hunting ground for beavers, and the fur trappers working at the outposts couldn't resist. A number of expeditions began to take place deep into the heart of the Nahanni territory. Alexander MacLeod, no relation to Willie and Frank MacLeod, traveled into the mountains with a band of Dene in search of the legendary Nahanni tribe, mainly to make contact with them and to establish a rapport in order to be granted permission to hunt beavers on their land. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, they weren't able to locate or come across any members of this lost tribe, and were forced to travel back to one of the nearby trading posts. A full year later, Alexander endorsed another man by the name of John MacLeod, no relation to Alexander or the two brothers Willie and Frank. Lots of MacLeods in the Nahanni for some reason, I know. But he endorsed him to do what he could not, to search and find the lost Nahanni tribe in the Mackenzie Mountains. John was a very tough, no-nonsense type of man, who was respected by all the men he came across for his skills as a woodsman and a talented leader. Described once as firm but flexible, these aspects were why he was chosen to search for the Nahanni tribe and establish relations with them. He departed Fort Simpson in June of 1823, with 2 French-Canadian explorers, a Métis translator, and 7 Aboriginal guides, most of whom were hesitant on venturing into the mountains in search of the dreaded Nahanni people. Just under a week had passed and the small group had finally entered into the Nahanni tribe's territory. As was custom for the Dene, they built signal fires upon entering another tribe's territory to show they meant no harm and were willing to meet. The tribes whose territory they were encroaching on would build a smoky signal fire themselves to show they wanted to meet as well. If by chance the tribe did not want the newcomers in their territory, they simply wouldn't build one. And this is what met John and his team. Not a single smoke plume indicated the Nahanni wanted to meet. But undeterred from this setback, John was still hopeful, so he and his small team pushed further in. For the next few days, the team traversed over several mountains and came across both spring and winter camps that had belonged to the Nahanni. The impression of teepee rings in the dirt, remains of charcoal fires sat cold on the ground, and the scattering of meat drying racks were evident someone had been here within the past couple seasons. It was here they attempted another large signal fire, blowing smoke high into the sky hoping for any kind of response. Seeing how they were now deep in this lost tribe's territory and happened to be in one of their old camps now, they hoped a signal fire would catch the eye of anyone curious and willing to meet. And their hopes would come true here. Off in the distance, they spotted the small clouds of black and gray smoke emanating deep from within the forest. Taking this as a good sign, John and his men quickly moved towards the signal fire, pushing past the thick branches of the forest. In a short time, John's group pushed past one final pine branch and were face to face with a hunting party of 14 Nahanni. Approaching slowly, with their hands raised, the two parties came closer and closer. Things, however, took an unexpected turn. The legends and stories of the Nahanni tribe were that of violent warriors who craved bloodshed. However, when first meeting them, John and his group found them to be actually quite pleasant people. Fairly soon after the meeting, and with the help of the Métis translator John had brought with them, the two groups were sitting around a campfire together unarmed, joyfully sharing spoils of the Nahanni hunt and the goods John's company had brought along with them. On his first impression of the Nahanni men, John MacLeod mentioned this in his journal about them. The Nahanni appear to be a manly race of men and good hunters. They are smart, active, and quick in their motions. They seem to be peacefully inclined, without the appearance of fears or meanness. They are cleanly, hospitable, and sociable. The two parties camped as one that night, and continued to share stories of each other's adventures and songs from their different cultures. In the morning, the two groups exchanged gifts to one another. To the leader of the Nahanni hunting band, whose name was White Eyes, John gifted a chief's coat, half axe, hand dagger, a small handheld mirror, a kettle, some red oral feathers, fire strikers, and some extra meat to replace the ones they had eaten the previous night. Reportedly extremely pleased with all of these gifts, White Eyes then gifted John and his team 17 pelts they had acquired from their hunt. White Eyes, through the help of John's Métis interpreter, also shared knowledge of the land they were in, telling John the area he and his band lived, as well as the local knowledge for the best hunting areas. The two groups actually had such a great time together, they all found it rather difficult to say goodbye, and both decided to spend another night together in celebration of their new friendship. When the sun rose the next day, John and his group decided it was time to leave, but also made plans to rendezvous with White Eyes and his men the following year to further establish this new friendship. And the two held true to this promise. Both men met again near the same area they had the previous year. Upon meeting his new friend once more, John quickly learned the past winter was rough on the Nahanni people, and they had accumulated very little animal pelts to trade with. Maybe a bit disappointed, but also concerned his friends were under stock, John invited White Eyes and his son and nephew to Fort Simpson with them, partly to introduce them to the outpost so that they may come and trade at, and to also supply White Eyes with whatever necessities he and his people might need. After several days of travel, John and White Eyes arrived in Fort Simpson. Upon entering the front gates, John would look over at his new friend with a smile and later say, the natives seemed lost in the astonishment and were surprised. These nomadic people had never seen such a well-established fort before. John decided it might be best to leave the three men to take in their new surroundings and adjust to this new environment. So, for most of the day, John and a few others guided their guests around the fort, showing them various ways on how to build tools and clothing, and how to properly dress animal skins so that the valuable fur were preserved and could be traded. When night came, the members of the fort treated their guests to various Scottish, French-Canadian, and Métis fiddle tunes, which seemed to delight them to no end. John later wrote, "Music seemed to delight them, and in short, they were lost in wonder and admiration." The next morning, White Eyes and his son and nephew thanked their hosts for their incredible hospitality and left with saying this to John, "I am like a child now in my own estimation. You treat us so well that I have nothing to give makes me ashamed to speak, which is the reason I appear silent. All in my party and children will be curious to come here and see what I have seen." John saw off his new friends into the wild and made sure they made it back to their territory safely after gifting them with various supplies and goods, ensuring them that they will always be welcome back at the fort. For the next several years, the Hudson Bay Company and White Eyes Group grew their relationship, the Nahanni people making the sporadic pilgrimage from their mountain homes to Fort Simpson to trade, and allowing fur trappers to enter their territory and hunt alongside them. But sadly, this friendship wasn't to last. Although the use of metal tools and firearms greatly increased the Nahanni tribe's quality of life, we know from much of Canadian and American history the natives of the continent weren't immune to the various diseases white men brought with them. Influenza, smallpox, and tuberculosis ravaged and devastated the Nahanni population, and tragically, by the 1900s, they were all but wiped out. The rather sinister reputation the Nahanni people presented to the rest of the world seems to be rather convoluted at best. Early interactions with the people, as we learned from Raymond Patterson's encounter and White Eyes and his group, we find they were nowhere near as evil as the stories say they were. If anything, they were just curious. While also reclusive, they were a warm people, eager to learn new ways of life, and also respected strangers so long as that respect was given back to them. The stories describing them as hostile, bloodthirsty savages seem to fall flat when we look into individual stories of interactions with them. They were once a proud, strong nation who seemingly lived pleasant and peaceful lives. Although they are blamed for much of the mysterious deaths that have taken place in the valley, like the McLeod brothers, Martin Jorgensen, or the Yukon Fisher, there is no evidence to support these claims. To me, it would seem the early frontiersmen needed a way to explain these strange happenings, and needed someone to point the finger at. The reclusive and mysterious tribe who lived in the mountains was a perfect target for this early propaganda. But we have to think about this. The Lost Nahad tribe were a real tribe. Evidence through oral stories from surviving tribes and the archaeological digs tell us they were in fact a group of mountain-dwelling people who lived thousands of years ago. Now, whether or not the Nahanni natives were descendants of these mysterious people, that remains to be said. The two differ quite a bit when it comes to interacting with others, but people do change with time. Perhaps there was a time in history long ago when the Nahanni tribe were guilty of the acts they were accused to have dealt. But as I said, this remains to be discovered. There was, however, one woman who may have had influence over the tribe in their early days. A woman who seemed to have been out of place, but said to dominate the Nahanni tribe and surrounding lands with the utmost respect and guidance. A woman who may have been the one to have led the Nahanni down not only a path of strength, but also a path of peace. The White Queen. There are many who doubt the existence of the White Queen. She was an almost mythical figure who, against all norms, found herself holding incredible sway and influence among most of the natives around the Nahanni Valley. There's not too much about her, aside from the legend telling of her existence, which is maybe why many question if she was real or not. As we have learned in this episode, not every legend or story could be true. Her story begins like so many other Nahanni legends have, with the Hudson Bay Company and a man by the name of Robert Campbell. Robert had been traveling through the Nahanni wilds in 1837 to establish a trading post on Dease Lake, a task previously given to a man by the name of John Hutchinson, but who had failed a year prior after being chased from the area by a large war band of Nahanni mountain men. Determined to do what his predecessor could not, Robert brought along a crew of men from Fort Liard, who were also employed by the Hudson Bay Company. Their journey to Dease Lake was relatively uneventful, and as soon as they arrived, Robert put to work his crew on building the outpost, along with a small group of reinforcements from Fort Simpson sent to assist in establishing the new post. Robert, along with an interpreter named Francis Hoole and two young native hunters named Lappy and Kitsa, decided it would be best to explore and survey the surrounding area, so the little group headed out west through the woods. Knowing John McLeod had been out in the same area a few years prior, the group managed to find an old Indian trail he had mentioned in his journal about his travels here. It was here Robert and his men would discover the smoke of a campfire rising above the treetops, and wanting to make a good first impression and eager to meet the locals, he, along with Lappy and Kitsa, hurried across the river that separated them. Hoole, on the other hand, was a little nervous in meeting strange new people, and wished to stay behind and wait on the other side of the river after it was made sure it was safe to approach. When the three men landed on the other side and approached the campsite, they found it to be suspiciously empty. A single tent sat fixed beside a burning campfire and boiled salmon resting in a Russian-made metal pot. The 3 frontiersmen then searched and called out for whoever had made this camp and had apparently fled upon noticing the men coming near. But to no luck, the 3 men were left alone at the small campsite. Finding themselves to be fairly peckish, the 3 men decided to sit down and enjoy the prepared meal. They left behind a well-crafted knife and a pouch of tobacco in exchange. Upon finishing their dinner, the 3 men picked up their gear and crossed the river once more to rejoin Hool on the other side. After a day of brutal hiking and traversing the wilds, and the toll it put on the 4 men, it caused them to decide it might be best to set up camp for the night here, rather than try and travel back to the outpost in the dark. The night itself was fairly uneventful for the 4 men. It wasn't until the first light of dawn, when Hool had gotten up to go fetch a fresh pot of water from the river, is when he spotted a large band of 16 approaching Nahanni natives, staring at him from across the river. Hool, being the more timid of the group, of course began shouting out warnings to the others still in their tents. Despite his urging to leave the area quickly, Robert ignored Hool's request and calmly approached the edge of the river and hoisted up a pole with the Hudson Bay Company flag prominently being flown. This was his chance to finally meet some locals, and he didn't want to pass it up. After calling out to the large group to come over and join their camp, the group of Nahannis conversed among themselves for a short while, but ended up agreeing and began crossing the river towards the 4 men. As the 2 groups got together and sat around the fire, both unsure what the other wanted, the leader of the Nahanni band decided to make the first move, and reached into one of his many pouches and produced some tobacco and a pipe. It wasn't long before both groups became one, enjoying each other's company and passing the pipe around in a large circle. It was here, after the pipe had finished a full rotation around the circle, Robert learned that the men sitting in front and around him were the legendary dreaded Nahanni mountain men so many people feared. And it was also here Robert learned the Nahanni had come down from the mountain to attend a great gathering of the tribes, hosted by the Tlingit tribe. Being trading partners and allies, the Nahanni leader was instructed by the Tlingit chief to kill any white men who appeared from the east. Fortunately for Robert and his company, the leader of the Nahanni band didn't particularly care for being bossed around by another tribe's chief and had decided to ignore the instructions. But despite learning these dangerous details, Robert was intrigued. He immediately expressed his interest in this massive gathering of tribes and wished to attend the gathering as well on behalf of his company. The leader of the Nahannis was quite alarmed at hearing this. He warned Robert that a powerful Tlingit chief named Shakes presided over the whole event, and that if Robert and his men were to come with or follow them to the gathering, Shakes would kill them. The Nahanni leader did say though, while I and my men would be willing to protect you, we could not do so, as Shakes' men are like the sands on the beach, meaning there were far too many to defend against if they were to attack. Still determined to see this meeting, Robert and his men tagged along with the traveling band, hearing nothing but the persistent warnings from the members of the group that the 4 should turn back and stay away. They were more than likely heading straight towards their deaths. Robert didn't listen though and continued the 24-kilometer hike down the river with them. Their long trek through the wilderness was evidently worth it when they had finally crested a high hill that overlooked an incredible view of the Aboriginal mega camp, with a sea of moose-skin tents and clouds of hundreds of campfires filling the valley they were in. Astonished at the sight, Robert wrote describing the scene. Such a concourse of Indians I had ever seen assembled. They were gathered from all parts of the western slope of the Rockies and along the Pacific coast. Robert descended down the hill with the other Nahanni men and was immediately surrounded by inquisitive natives interested in seeing a white man from the east, most probably seeing one for the first time in their lives. Word of the white man coming into the encampment had spread incredibly fast, because a short while after walking into the perimeter, Robert was met with a fast-approaching man, one of whom obviously commanded the respect and deference the parting men allotted him. There could have been no doubt. Robert was about to come face to face with Shakes, chief of the Tlingit people. Without a word, an opposing Shake sternly looked down at Robert and shook his hand and guided him towards his tent. Realizing he had no other choice, Robert obliged and followed the opposing figure to a large tent, which sat up against a rock face. Pushing past the animal skin that draped across the front of the tent, Robert was met with 4 Russian Promshalenikis, Russian indigenous fur traders. They were esteemed guests of Chief Shakes and were just as surprised to see Robert walk into the tent as he was to see them when he entered. And while the four were courteous towards Robert, offering him a glass of whiskey and inviting him to join their discussion, they also showed they were questioning themselves as to why he was here. Just as Robert sat down and began talking, a great commotion stirred from outside the tent. Puzzled at what it could be, the 6 men in the tent didn't even get a chance to stand before the 16 Nahanni men who Robert had traveled there with ripped down the moose skin coverings of the tent and burst in with their weapons drawn and poised for battle. They had suspected Chief Shakes had taken Robert to his tent to murder the man, and they had come to his rescue. The leader of the Nahanni men yelled out to Chief Shakes, "If the white chief is killed, there will be plenty of blood spilled here." But realizing he was safe for the time being, the warriors backed off and out of the tent, apologizing for the intrusion. Shakes forgave the sudden outburst, but led Robert away a little further, asking him to share a demonstration of his double-barreled percussion rifle. But something felt off to Robert. The way the Nahanni men had acted around Shakes, and how strange and overly friendly Shakes had been acting towards him, was something that put him on high alert. After being drawn away from those who would protect him to show off his rifle, Robert had the sneaking suspicion Shakes was trying to trick him into emptying the rounds in his gun so he could ambush him once he was defenseless. But Robert agreed to demonstrate the power of his gun. If this wasn't a trap, he wanted to get on Shakes' good side, and if it was, maybe he could outsmart the man. Shooting at a distant target, Robert was able to skillfully hit it, much to the enjoyment of Shakes and his men watching. But instead of emptying the second barrel, Robert instead quickly loaded another round into the one he had just emptied. He had suspected Shakes was waiting for just the right moment when his gun had spent all of its ammunition to attack, so Robert, thinking a step ahead, purposefully kept a bullet loaded and ready to fire at all times, just in case. But Shakes kept wanting him to keep shooting over and over, seemingly wanting the rifle to empty, and growing more impatient each time Robert reloaded another bullet before shooting off both of them. Eventually, Robert noticed Shakes had stopped paying attention to his shooting, and was quietly discussing something with some of his men a little ways away. So taking this chance, Robert slipped away from the group and made his way back through the camp. For some reason, Robert at some point lost his rifle. It's not said what happened to it, but he eventually made his way back up to the hill where he had initially come from when he had first laid eyes on the camp. It's here he would feel a wave of relief rush over him, as he was met with some familiar figures. Kitsa, Lappy, and Hool were all on top of the hill watching him as he climbed. But there was also a fourth figure watching him, a woman, who would become known as the legend we are currently discussing. Robert quickly learned the beautiful woman standing with his companions was actually the chiefess of the Nahannis who he had traveled with that morning. Instantly he was caught off guard at hearing this fair-skinned woman was the leader of the Nahanni tribe. And of course, Kitsa, Lappy, and Hool all had questions regarding Robert's adventure down into the camp, and after regaling them with his run-in with the dreaded Chief Shakes, he expressed disappointment in the fact much of his items and his prized rifle were either missing or stolen, and were gone for good. Once she heard this, the chiefess standing before them without a word marched straight down the hill and into the camp, only to appear about an hour later with every single item Robert had mentioned losing. She graciously handed over each lost item to a bewildered and quite smitten Robert. She commanded the respect not only of her own people, but of the tribes they had intercourse with, later said Robert. She was a fine-looking woman rather above the middle height of about 35 years old. In her actions and personal appearance, she was more like the whites than the pure Indian race. She had a pleasing face, lit up with fine, intelligent eyes, which when she was excited, flashed like fire. After having granted Robert his lost personal goods, she then delivered somewhat of a cryptic warning to the group of men. Looking back down towards the camp, she watched as people moved in a hurry, and looked back at Robert and said their lives depended on their speedy departure from the area. The four didn't need to be told twice, and with haste, the group, including the chiefess, departed the scene and down the river they had once traveled by. When it was time to part ways between the four men and the woman, Robert found it rather difficult to say goodbye to their new friend. As a parting gift, he gave her a long bow, and handed her a handkerchief as a token of his affection and friendship. In return, the lady simply smiled and slipped 2 silver bracelets from her wrist and placed them onto his. When the four later returned to camp, where their future outpost on Dease Lake would later stand, they shared their incredible story with those who had stayed behind. To his pleasure, Robert and company returned to find the men had made quite a bit of progress on the new fort, but had neglected to establish a sufficient supply of provisions for the winter. So, hoping Fort Simpson could provide some for them, Robert, along with Lappy, left for Fort Simpson later in August. To their dismay, however, they were turned away after learning Fort Simpson couldn't provide the very much needed food and supplies. So for the next winter, the men at Dease Lake suffered setback after setback. During the winter months, hunting in the area was scarce. 3 of the men succumbed to hunger, and the rest had to resort to eating whatever scraps they could scrounge up. Not only this, but on those calm freezing days when they finally got a break from the snow falling, the men at the outpost were shot at by a group of Nahanni natives who continued to harass the outpost for several weeks. But not everything was terrible. Robert and the men were eventually visited by an old friend, the White Queen and some of her subjects. Seeing the dismay and pitiful state the men were in at the fort, the Forever Kind chiefess commanded her own people to prepare and share a tremendous feast of salmon steaks and caribou meat for their hosts. Of course, it should also be mentioned those Nahanni people who accompanied her to the fort were on their best behavior. There were those who did not realize she was paying a visit, and those who had been harassing the fort for the past several weeks made a visit later on that same night. Without so much as a peep, the invading warriors were able to stealthily sneak inside the fort's wooden walls and past its defenses, where they then were able to burst right through the large trade room doors, surprising all the men inside, catching them off guard. A quick fight ensued between the two sides, but the fact the invaders had weapons and the element of surprise, the men from the outpost quickly found themselves outmatched and surrendering not before long. When the invading Nahanni warriors were debating on what to do with their new captives, they were shocked to hear a stern cough coming behind them from the door they had just burst through. Standing in the doorway was the furious red face of the White Queen, steaming with anger at the sudden attack on her hosts and waking her from her sleep. Almost immediately, the invading Nahannis went pale, and they dropped their weapons and looked to the ground in shame, unable to avoid the fiery glare their chiefess shot at them. She walked between them and Robert and his men, and with pure rage, found the lead instigator of the attack, spit in his face and stomped on his feet in anger. She then demanded they leave the outpost and never return to it. She would deal with them back at the tribe's camp. The following day, the White Queen and the few Nahannis who had initially accompanied her to the fort made their final goodbyes to Robert and the men at the Lake Dease outpost. Robert would bid his final goodbye to the Queen of the Nahanni. As the men watched her in admiration, she led her small band of tribesmen through the thick bush and out of eyesight. It would be the last time they, or anyone, would ever see her again. But her influence, the respect she commanded from her peers, and the sheer bravery she exhibited grew into stories the men at the outpost would share to their dying day. The legacy of the White Queen remains to this day nearly 200 years later as another one of Nahanni's amazing legends. Who knows who she might have actually have been, or what her own origins really were, but for the tribes and the men living in the Nahanni back in the early 1800s, she was an out-of-place unique person. One who was influential and powerful, but was overall a good soul, who blessed the Nahanni Valley with justice and with grace. The history of the Nahanni Valley is long and complex, as we have learned from this episode. Most of the occupants who once inhabited its lands for hundreds of years have unfortunately moved on from this world, but their stories remain to this day for us to enjoy and learn about. No interesting place is born without interesting history. So while I know this episode might not have been as exciting as a manhunt like in the one we focused on in the second episode, or the mysterious decapitations we talked about in the first, the history of the lost Nahad tribe, the Nahanni natives, and the White Queen are all equally just as important into making the Nahanni Valley a truly fascinating place to behold. As for the contents of this episode, all the events we talked about had taken place hundreds of years ago, so we should, as always, take these stories with a grain of salt. As I said earlier in the episode, the legends and stories we hear today are written and told by the survivors, and sometimes those who survived have done so at the expense of others. The fate of the Nahanni Aboriginals was one of that of a near immediate extinction, based from the unintentional and also some likely intentional actions of those who settled the Great White North. The stories we talked about here have painted those white men and women who settled here as the protagonists. However, considering our history, I do not have any doubts that many of the native inhabitants had met their share of abuse and mistreatment by the hands of those who lived on. It's an unfortunate reality of our past, and their stories are worth telling in my opinion. The Nahanni, before disappearing, were a proud, powerful nation, and they deserved better despite the stories told of them. There are many who would believe they are the ones responsible for the decapitations taking place in Dead Man's Valley, but there is no evidence now, as there was none back then, that pointed them to being the culprits. Of course, there are bad apples in every group all around the world, so perhaps the assumption someone or multiple citizens of the valley with native blood did carry out such acts to protect their lands and resources, but we will simply never know for sure. The only thing we do know is that the decapitations did indeed happen, and that just from the tiny bit of history we have covered so far about the valley, we know this is a place that is capable of complete mayhem. Many of these mysteries will forever remain unsolved. The lost Nahat tribe will likely remain lost forever, their fate unknown to the rest of the world. The Nahanni tribe, who dominated the valley for centuries, were feared and avoided, but the stories we have of them tell us they were like any other tribe. Some stories even praise their kindness, like with their White Queen, which contradicts the stories claiming them to be bloodthirsty warriors. So we are here at the end of the episode, and at the same spot we have been since we started this series. We have more questions than answers. And to my discontent, we are more than likely not going to solve many of these questions. But there are a few more things we can talk about that may explain a thing or two about this valley. These things, though, like the spirits we had discussed in part 2 of this series, lie more in the realm of the unbelievable and the unknown. The mysterious eyes who followed and watched Charlie McLeod and his group way back in part 1 belonged to something. The reason why the Dene tribe feared the Mackenzie Mountains so much wasn't just because of the Nahat tribe. There were other things living up there. And the stories of magnificent beasts who prowled this prehistoric oasis might have more legitimacy than most would think. We'll be talking about all of it in the final part in this series next week, so be sure to tune in for that. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe or follow the podcast on whatever app you're listening on so you can be sure to catch the final episode. And if you happen to be using Apple, if you could do me a favor and give the podcast a 5-star review after this episode is done, I would appreciate it a ton. The best way you can support the podcast is by giving it a great review, or by sharing it with your friends and family and get them hooked. Word of mouth is the best way for any show to grow, and I would be forever grateful to those who enjoy the show so much they share it with others in their lives. If you have a story involving the supernatural or paranormal and you're dying to tell someone, I'd love to hear about it. You can email me at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com, or you can direct message me on Instagram at moonlightlorepodcast. I love hearing from those who love the show, so don't hesitate to reach out, even if it's just to say hi. I love hearing from you guys. We have just one more part to do to wrap up this series, and as I mentioned, it's coming out next week hopefully, so be ready for that. But until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.